What's really changed over the last several years that I've been doing this work, especially from the first edition to the second edition, and what did I emphasize? And one of the things that I emphasized with a whole new team of researchers was, in the first edition, I focused more about the macro, getting into a helicopter and going 1,000 feet and looking down at where are kids in general, and tried not to work too hard at making, showing distinctions between subgroups for whatever reason. After that book came out, I've done a lot more research in urban settings and in what I end up calling privileged kids settings, whether it's private school or private religious or Christian schools, homeschooled kids, over-resourced kids, famous kids. In other words, looking at adolescents that have more than the average or are given the message that they are better than the average. And I use the word privilege because that's what Madeline Levine uses in her book, really great book, The Price of Privilege, as well as contrasting that with the kids on the other end of the margin who are vulnerable. That's the term I use, whether they're vulnerable because of racism or economics, poverty, violence, family background, part of the country they live in, whether they are vulnerable and marginalized because of their own struggle with their own sexuality or their understanding of their body type, or maybe they are slightly learning disabled or significantly handicapped. It's so kids at the margin. So on the one hand, vulnerable, on the other hand, privileged. And when I went into the first study, what I realized is the categories of exemplars, basically superstars, and then at-risk kids, and then the kids, what we ended up calling the middle kids, because that's what one teacher called them. I hate the term. But these categories, at-risk, middle, and kind of the exemplars, really did not match with my research. It's that all kids are doing the best they can to figure out how to navigate the complex waters of adolescence. Well, that's what HERT 1 was about, and HERT 2.0 is also about that. But what is it for the privileged and the vulnerable kids in terms of the key forces of growing up? Basically what I ended up discovering is that they both have even more significant challenges ahead of them. We would think the elite, the privileged, the private school kids, the homeschool kids, the beautiful kids, the smartest kids are somehow going to be better off. But actually in my research, what we've seen is that they are actually more stunted in their ability to live out of a sense of self. It takes them longer to discover who they are and their own power. They are skilled adapters as the privileged kids. They learn the social cues for who they ought to be as opposed to who they actually are. And therefore they are constantly playing this great battle of the American pretense of one thing on the outside and a whole other story on the inside. And we discovered that and talk about it. Vulnerable kids, it's obvious. A kid raised in violence learns that through violence you get affirmation. A kid that is cast aside will find others who have also been cast aside and finds comfort in a very small community but feels incredibly isolated. All kids feel isolated, but the vulnerable kids feel even more isolated. And so the issues just become more pronounced on the margins. So we have a whole new chapter in HERT 2.0 on kids at the margins.